There's something different about people who listen more than they talk. Maybe it's the way they pause before responding, letting silence stretch where others would rush to fill the void. Maybe it's how they remember the small details you mentioned 3 conversations ago, things you barely remember saying yourself. Maybe it's that calm, steady presence they carry, like they're operating from a different frequency than the noise around them, because listening more than you talk didn't just make you quieter. It forged a specific type of psychological depth that experts are only now beginning to understand. And by the end of this script, you're going to see why people who mastered this rare skill created some of the most emotionally intelligent individuals alive today. Let's start with something most people get completely wrong. Society celebrates the talkers, the confident ones who command every room, who always have something to say. But people who listen more than they talk prove that theory dead wrong. Picture yourself as a 7-year-old sitting at the dinner table. Your parents are discussing something important, their voices rising and falling with emotion. You're not interrupting. You're watching. You notice how your mother's jaw tightens when she's holding something back, how your father's hand moves to his temple when he's processing difficult information. You're learning to read the room before you even knew that's what it was called. The weight of unspoken words settles around you like humidity before rain. You're absorbing patterns, cataloging reactions, understanding that communication happens in the spaces between words. This wasn't passive. This was your education in emotional complexity. Picture this. 3rd grade. You're sitting in a circle during show and tell, and everyone's fighting to go next, hands shooting up, voices overlapping. You're watching the boy who brought his turtle, how his face lights up when someone actually asks a question, instead of just waiting for their turn. You notice the girl whose voice gets quieter when people aren't listening, how she shrinks back into herself. You're cataloging all of this, understanding social dynamics in real time, seeing how people respond to being heard versus being ignored. This wasn't shyness, it was strategic observation. You learn to understand people before engaging with them, to read the temperature of social situations with unusual accuracy. Here's what's remarkable. While others were practicing talking, you were practicing something far more sophisticated. Psychologists call this hypervigilant social awareness, but for people who listen more than they talk, it was just how you move through the world. Here's what's extraordinary. Research suggests this kind of early pattern recognition builds neural pathways for empathy that talkers simply don't develop at the same depth. Kids today grow up with constant noise, earbuds in, content streaming, silence treated like an emergency to fix. They're losing the ability to observe without commenting. But you learn to be comfortable in the quiet spaces where real understanding happens. This wasn't withdrawal. It was strategic positioning. Picture this. You're 11 years old, sitting in the back seat during a long car ride. Your parents are talking in the front, using that careful tone adults use when they're discussing something serious but pretending it's casual. You're not looking at your phone because smartphones don't exist yet. You're listening to every word, every pause, every shift in tone. You're learning to hear what's not being said, to decode the subtext beneath the surface conversation. The hum of the engine becomes white noise. Their words become a puzzle you're solving in real time. This wasn't eavesdropping. It was becoming fluent in emotional nuance. You learned to detect stress before it exploded, to sense conflict before it surfaced. The outcome? You developed what psychologists now call emotional self-regulation through environmental scanning. Neuroscientists call this pattern recognition for emotional intelligence. But for people who listen more, it was just survival skills. Here's what's remarkable. This kind of deep listening activates the default mode network in your brain, building connections between memory, emotion, and prediction. Modern kids get told exactly what everyone's feeling through explicit communication and emoji translations. They miss the training in reading between the lines. But you built an internal dictionary of human behavior that serves you every single day. This wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. Picture this. You're 13, and someone you care about is going through something devastating. Maybe it's a friend whose parents are divorcing. Maybe it's a grandparent facing illness. Maybe it's your own family crisis. You're sitting with them, and you realize you have absolutely nothing to say that would make it better. Every phrase that comes to mind sounds hollow, performative, insufficient, so you say nothing. You just sit there, present and uncomfortable, letting the silence hold what words cannot. The weight of that helplessness presses against your chest, but you don't look away. This wasn't failing to comfort. It was learning the profound difference between fixing and witnessing. You learn to tolerate the discomfort of someone else's pain without rushing to make yourself feel better by offering solutions. Here's where it gets interesting. This taught you that sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer is simply not leaving. Psychologists call this frustration, tolerance, and presence without intervention. But for people who listen more than they talk, it was just understanding your limits. Here's what's remarkable. Research shows that people who can sit with uncomfortable silence develop stronger emotional bonds than those who fill every gap with words. Today's generation treats silence like failure, rushing to send the perfect supportive text, the right GIF, anything to avoid the raw discomfort of just being there. They're fluent in sympathy but strangers to true empathy. But you learn that love sometimes sounds like nothing at all. This wasn't coldness. It was profound respect. Picture this. You're 15, working your first real job. There's a co-worker who's been there for years, someone who knows all the unwritten rules, all the shortcuts, all the politics. Instead of pretending you already know everything or waiting to figure it out through trial and error, you ask questions. Real questions. Not to fill space, but to actually learn. You notice they light up when asked. That people love sharing their expertise when someone genuinely wants to know. You're taking mental notes, connecting dots, building a framework for understanding how this place actually works beneath the official procedures. This wasn't brown-nosing, it was recognizing that strategic questions are more powerful than impressive statements. You learn to extract knowledge efficiently, to make people feel valued while actually gathering intelligence. The outcome? You developed competence faster than your peers who are too busy performing confidence. Neuroscientists call this executive function through information gathering. But for people who listen more, it was just common sense. Here's what's extraordinary. Asking good questions requires more cognitive complexity than making statements because you have to predict what information gaps exist. Modern workers confuse being vocal in meetings with being valuable, talking to prove they belong, rather than listening to understand what's actually needed. They're optimizing for visibility over competence. But you learn that the quietest person in the room often understands the most. This wasn't timidity. It was tactical intelligence. Picture this. You're 16, and your friend group is fragmenting over drama you didn't create. People are taking sides, demanding loyalty declarations, spreading competing versions of what happened. You're in the rare position of having heard everyone's story actually heard it, because you're the one person who doesn't immediately launch into judgment or advice. You're the Switzerland of teenage chaos. You understand that everyone's version is true from their perspective, that hurt people, that the situation is more complex than the binary of right and wrong everyone wants to impose. This wasn't fence-sitting, it was developing calibrated risk assessment in social navigation. You learn to see multiple truths simultaneously, to hold complexity without needing to resolve it immediately. Here's what happened. You became the person people trusted with their actual feelings, not just their public positions. Psychologists call this social intelligence and perspective-taking capacity.
But for people who listen more than they talk, it was just how you survived high school.
Here's what's remarkable. This ability to hold multiple narratives without immediate judgment is the foundation of adult diplomacy and leadership. Today's teens perform their friendships on social media, every alliance public, every conflict documented, nuance impossible in comment sections and story posts. They're learning to take sides instantly rather than understand deeply. But you learn that real influence comes from being trusted by all sides. This wasn't neutrality. It was sophisticated analysis. Picture this. You're in your early 20s, sitting in meetings or classes where louder voices dominate. Someone takes credit for your idea that you mentioned quietly 10 minutes earlier, now presenting it as their breakthrough. You watch confident people get promoted or praised for saying less insightful things with more volume. You feel the frustration of being overlooked, of watching substance lose to style over and over. Your contributions get attributed to others. Your insights get forgotten until someone else repeats them louder. The injustice of it burns, but you don't change who you are. This wasn't acceptance of mistreatment. It was building resilience through stress inoculation while maintaining your integrity. You learn to document your contributions, to choose your moments strategically, to play a longer game than quarterly performance reviews. Here's where it gets interesting. This forced you to develop substance so undeniable that eventually people had to notice. Neuroscientists call this delayed gratification and internal locus of control. But for people who listen more, it was just surviving systems built for extroverts. Here's what's extraordinary. Research shows that people who succeed despite being underestimated develop more sustainable confidence than those who are immediately celebrated. Modern culture tells everyone to speak up, lean in, take up space, that silence is complicity or insecurity. They're creating a generation terrified of being overlooked, optimizing for attention over depth. But you learned that real power doesn't need to announce itself constantly. This wasn't doormat behavior. It was strategic patience. Picture this. You're 25, and you realize you carry a substantial collection of other people's secrets. Not because you asked for them, but because you created space where people felt safe enough to be honest. You know about the marriage that's failing, the addiction someone's hiding, the career crisis, the health scare, the family dysfunction. You hold these truths carefully, never weaponizing them, never gossiping, never using them for social currency. But they accumulate, these confidences, and sometimes the weight of knowing so much about so many people feels heavy in a way you can't explain to anyone. This wasn't being a therapist to your friends. It was understanding that trust is built in moments of vulnerability and protected through discretion. You learn that people don't need you to fix their problems as much as they need to feel less alone in them. The outcome? You became a safe harbor in a world of performance and judgment. Psychologists call this emotional labor and confidentiality as relationship maintenance. But for people who listen more than they talk, it was just the natural consequence of actually being trustworthy. Here's what's remarkable. This ability to hold space for others without making it about yourself is increasingly rare in an oversharing culture. Now, let's talk about today's social media natives who broadcast every feeling, who perform vulnerability for likes, who confuse exposure with intimacy. They're losing the muscle for private, sacred confidence between two people. But you learned that some things are more powerful when held quietly. This wasn't being a pushover, it was being a vault. Picture this. You're in a conversation that matters, maybe a negotiation, maybe a conflict, maybe a moment where someone's deciding whether to trust you with a real story. They say something, then stop. The silence stretches. Every instinct in them wants you to fill it, to move on, to let them off the hook. But you don't. You wait. You make eye contact. You let the pause do its work. And then they keep talking, going deeper, revealing the actual issue beneath the surface problem. You've learned that silence is a tool, that patience extracts truth better than interrogation. This wasn't manipulation. It was understanding that people need space to arrive at their own honesty. You learn to be comfortable in the discomfort that makes others crack open. Here's what happened. You gained access to levels of authenticity that talkers never reach, because they're too busy filling every gap with their own words. Neuroscientists call this strategic use of the default mode network and impulse control. But for people who listen more, it was just recognizing patterns. Here's what's extraordinary. Research shows that pauses of just 3 to 5 seconds dramatically increase the depth of what people reveal. But most conversationalists can't tolerate even 2 seconds of silence. Fast forward to modern communication culture where response time is measured in seconds, where read receipts create anxiety, where silence is interpreted as rejection or anger. People are losing tolerance for the natural rhythm of thoughtful exchange. But you learned that the best insights emerge from pauses, not speed. This wasn't game playing, it was respecting the process of truth. Picture this. You're 30 and you start noticing a pattern. When you spend time with anxious people, they leave calmer. When you're with someone who's been talking non-stop, desperate to be heard, they eventually run out of performance and settle into something more real. People regularly tell you that conversations with you are different, that they feel actually listened to, that they said things to you they didn't plan to say. You've become a mirror that reflects people back to themselves with unusual clarity, not through advice or judgment, but through the quality of your attention. This wasn't having special powers. It was the compounding effect of decades of practice in presence over performance. You learned that most people are so rarely truly heard that even basic attention feels transformative to them. The outcome? You've built relationships of unusual depth while others collect hundreds of shallow connections. Psychologists call this active listening and therapeutic presence without formal training. But for people who listen more than they talk, it was just being consistent with who you've always been. Here's what's remarkable. Brain imaging studies show that feeling genuinely heard activates reward centers similar to being loved or valued. Consider how modern culture measures relationship success through quantity, followers, friends, connections, network size. People are optimizing for breadth while losing capacity for depth. But you learned that 3 people who truly know you matter more than 3,000 who recognize your face. This wasn't being special. It was being real. Picture this. You're in a world that's getting progressively louder. Everyone has a platform, an opinion, a hot take, a personal brand to build. The volume keeps increasing while the listening keeps decreasing. And you realize that what once felt like a disadvantage, your natural inclination toward listening over talking, has become almost radical. You're watching society fracture along lines of people screaming past each other, and you understand that what you offer, the ability to actually hear someone across a difference, to understand before responding, to value truth over being right, is desperately needed. This wasn't suddenly becoming valuable because trends changed. It was recognizing that you've been building the exact skill set this moment requires. You learned that in a world addicted to reaction, the ability to pause and consider is revolutionary. Here's where it gets interesting. You're not trying to fix the noise by adding to it, but by modeling a different way entirely. Neuroscientists call this emotional self-regulation in high-stimulus environments. But for people who listen more than they talk, it was just staying true to your nature while culture lost its mind. Here's what's extraordinary. Research suggests that societies with higher rates of contemplative practices and listening-based communication have measurably better conflict resolution and social cohesion. Today's algorithms reward hot takes and controversy, training people to perform outrage and certainty rather than curiosity and nuance. They're creating a generation that mistakes volume for value. But you learn that changing one mind through genuine understanding matters more than performing for thousands. This wasn't superiority, it was quiet knowing. But some experiences cut deeper. Consider the moment you realized that your listening wasn't appreciated as a gift, but often mistaken for having nothing to say. Maybe it was being passed over for a promotion because you weren't loud enough in meetings. Maybe it was watching someone you cared about choose the charismatic talker over you. Maybe it was family members interpreting your thoughtfulness as disengagement, your reflection as aloofness. You started wondering if you were doing it wrong, if you should force yourself to be more, to perform confidence you didn't feel, to fill silence you found comfortable. The doubt crept in slowly, then all at once. You questioned whether your deepest strength was actually your greatest weakness. This imprinted a painful awareness. The world often rewards the wrong things. But that clarity existed alongside something darker. You watched relationships implode because people talked past each other, saw careers built on charisma collapse when substance was required, witnessed the loneliness of people surrounded by audiences but known by no one. You saw the cost of the alternative path, You felt the exhaustion of people who built entire identities on being heard but never learned to listen. And you realized that your doubt, while painful, came from trying to succeed in a game designed for a different type of player. This created people who hold both truths. Deep listening is invaluable and often undervalued quiet. Wisdom is powerful and frequently overlooked. Your way is valid, and the world won't always recognize it. You could be louder and you'd lose something essential. This complexity might be their most valuable inheritance. Let's return to that dinner table from the beginning. 7 years old, watching, listening, learning to read the room before you could even name what you were doing. That child didn't know they were building a skill that would define their entire life, that would become both burden and gift, both challenge and superpower. These people carry something the modern world desperately needs. They remember what it feels like to be truly heard. They remember that understanding requires patience. They remember that silence isn't empty, it's full of everything people don't know how to say. They remember that the loudest voice isn't always the wisest, that quick responses aren't always thoughtful ones, that being right matters less than getting it right. They're living proof that resilience is built, not born, through years of being underestimated and staying authentic anyway. Competence comes from practice, not protection, from choosing depth over volume 1,000 times. The best gift isn't a smooth path, but the courage to walk a harder road with integrity intact. Real influence doesn't come from dominating conversations, but from the quality of presence you bring to them in a world of hot takes, algorithmic outrage, performance anxiety, and superficial connection. They stand as evidence of another way. Not perfect, not without costs, but a way that produced people who can hold space for complexity, who can hear what's not being said, who can sit with discomfort without rushing to resolve it, who can change minds through understanding rather than argument. They grew up learning to listen more than they talk, in families and schools and social situations that didn't always value that choice, navigating a culture that celebrated the opposite, building something profound in the quiet spaces where everyone else was making noise. And somehow they learned to hold it all. The world keeps getting louder, but they just keep listening.